Hey guys, it's me, Kari, and after a very long pause, I apologize. We are back to Girl Interrupted. So the chapter we're up to now, and this is my paperback edition with Winona Ryder on the cover, the movie art. This edition was released in 1993, I think. Anyway, page 83, if you're interested in following along, if you have the book at home. I know some people like to do that. Anyway, this chapter is called Keepers. Valerie was about 30. She was tall and had tapered legs and arms. She looked a lot like Lisa, though she was fair. They both had lean, long haunches and flexible joints. Lisa was good at curling herself into chairs and corners, and so was Valerie. When someone was upset and had tucked herself between a radiator and a wall or behind a bathtub or into another small secure spot, Valerie could curl herself into a compact package and sit near that person. Valerie's fair hair was beautiful, but she kept it hidden in a braid that she twisted up on the back of her head. This braid in a bun never came undone or slipped out of place. Rarely, Valerie could be coaxed into undoing the bun and showing us the braid, which reached to her waist. Only Lisa could convince her to do this. She never released her hair from the braid, though we begged her to. Valerie was strict and inflexible, and she was the only staff person we trusted. We trusted her because she wasn't afraid of us. She wasn't afraid of doctors either. She didn't have much to say about anything, and we liked her for that too. We had to hear a lot of talk in that place. Each of us saw 3 doctors a day, the ward doctor, the resident, and our own therapist. Mostly we had to hear ourselves talk to these doctors, but they did a fair amount of talking themselves. They had a special language: regression, acting out, hostility, withdrawal, indulging in behavior. This last phrase could be attached to any activity and make it sound suspicious. Indulging in eating behavior, talking behavior, writing behavior. In the outside world, people ate and talked and wrote, but nothing we did was simple. Valerie was a relief from that. The only phrase she used was acting out, and she used it correctly, to mean getting in my hair and driving me crazy. She said things like, "Cut that out," and "You're a bore." She said what she meant, just as we did. The doctors were men, the nurses and aides were women. There were 2 exceptions, Jerry the aide and Dr. Wick. Jerry was willowy and worried. He had one good trick. Now and then someone with a lot of privileges was allowed to leave the hospital in a taxi. That person would say, "Jerry, call me a cab." Jerry would say, "Your cab." We loved this. Dr. Wick was another story. Dr. Wick was the head of our ward, South Belknap too. The wards had boarding school names like East House and South Belknap, and Dr. Wick would have been a good boarding school matron. She came from Rhodesia, and she looked like the ghost of a horse. When she talked, she sounded somewhat like a horse as well. She had a low, burbly voice, and her colonial English accent gave her sentences a neighing cadence. Dr. Wick seemed utterly innocent about American culture, which made her an odd choice to head an adolescent girls' ward. And she was easily shocked about sexual matters. The word fuck made her pale horse face flush. It flushed a lot when she was around us. A representative conversation with Dr. Wick. "Good morning. It has been decided that you were compulsively promiscuous. Would you like to tell me about this?" "No." This is the best of several bad responses, I've decided. "For instance, the attachment to your high school English teacher." Dr. Wick always uses words like attachment. Would you like me to tell me about that?" Well, he drove me to New York. That was when I realized he was interested. He brought along a wonderful vegetarian lunch for me. But that wasn't when it was." "What? When what was?" "When we fucked." Flush. "Go on." "We went to the Frick. I'd never been there. There was this Vermeer, see? This amazing painting of a girl having a music lesson. I just couldn't believe how amazing it was. So when did you, when was it?" "Doesn't she want to hear about the Vermeer? That's what I remember." "What?" "The, attachment. How did it start?" "Oh, later, back home." Suddenly I know what she wants. I was at his house. We had poetry meetings at his house, and everybody had left, so we were just sitting there on the sofa alone. And he said, "Do you want to fuck?" Flush. He used that word? Yep. He didn't. He kissed me, and he'd kissed me in New York too, but why should I disappoint her? This was called therapy. Luckily, Dr. Wick had a lot of girls to take care of, so therapy with her was brief, maybe 5 minutes a day. But in her wake came the resident. There was a 2 or 3 minute breather between Dr. Wick's departure and the resident's arrival. During this time, we could think of new things to say or formulate complaints. Residents were in charge of privileges, medication, phone calls, the day-to-day matters that were not important enough for Dr. Wick to bother with. Residents changed every 6 months. We'd just begin to figure out how to manage one resident when he'd be snatched out from under us and replaced with a new, incomprehensible resident. They started out tough and ended up exhausted and ready to leave. A few started out with compassion. They ended up bitter because we took advantage of them. A representative conversation with a resident. Good morning. How are your bowel movements? I want to get off group. I want destination privileges. Do you have any headaches? I've been on group for 6 months. The head nurse said you were acting out after lunch yesterday. She's making that up. Hostility. He scribbles in a notebook. Can I have orders for Tylenol instead of aspirin? There's no difference. Aspirin gives me a stomach ache. Are you having headaches? This is in case I do. Hypochondria. He scribbles again. But these 2 doctors were hors d'oeuvres. The entree was the therapist. Most of us saw our therapist every day. Cynthia didn't. She had therapy twice a week and shock therapy once a week. And Lisa didn't go to therapy. She had a therapist, but he used her hour to take a nap. If she was extremely bored, she'd demand to be taken to his office, where she'd find him snoozing in his chair. Gotcha, she'd say. Then she'd come back to the ward. The rest of us traipsed off day after day to exhume the past. Therapists had nothing to do with our everyday lives. Don't talk about the hospital, my therapist said if I complained about Daisy or a stupid nurse. We're not here to talk about the hospital. They couldn't grant or rescind privileges, help us get rid of smelly roommates, stop aides from pestering us. The only power they had was the power to dope us up. Thorazine, Stelazine, Meloril, Librium, Valium, the therapist's friends. The resident could put us on that stuff too in a, quote, acute situation. Once we were on it, it was hard to get off. A bit like heroin, except it was the staff who got addicted to our taking it. You're doing so well, the resident would say. That was because those things knocked the heart out of us. 6 nurses, including Valerie and an aide or 2, were on duty during the day. The night staff consisted of 3 comfy, big-bosomed Irish women who called us dearie. Occasionally there was a comfy, big-bosomed black woman who called us honey. The night staff would hug us if we needed a hug. The day staff adhered to the no physical contact rule. Between day and night was a dark universe called evening, which began at 3:15, when the day staff retired to the living room to gossip about us with the evening staff. At 3:30, everyone emerged. Power had been transferred. From then until 11, when the comfy women took over, we were in Mrs. McWeenie's hands. Perhaps it was Mrs. McWeenie who made dusk such a dangerous time. No matter the season, dusk began at 3:15 with her arrival. Mrs. McWeenie was dry, tight, small, and pig-eyed. If Dr. Wick was a disguised boarding school matron, Mrs. McWeenie was an undisguised prison matron. She had her hard gray hair pressed into waves that grasped her scalp like a migraine. The day nurses, following Valerie's lead, wore unbuttoned nurse coats over street clothes. No such informality for Mrs. McWeenie. She wore a creaky white uniform and spongy ripple-soled shoes that she painted white every week. We could watch the paint cracking and peeling off between Monday and Friday. Mrs. McWeenie and Valerie did not get along. This was fascinating, like overhearing your parents having a fight. Mrs. McWeenie cast on Valerie's clothes and hair the same disapproving eye she gave us, and clicked her teeth with impatience as Valerie gathered her coat and pocketbook and left the nursing station at 3:30. Valerie ignored her. Valerie was able to ignore people in an obvious way. As long as Valerie was on the ward, we felt safe hating Mrs. McWeenie. But as soon as her long tapered back had receded down the hall and out the double-locked double doors, we were overcome by a gloom shot through with anxiety. Now Mrs. McWeenie was in power. Her power wasn't absolute, but it was close. She shared it with a mysterious doctor on call. She never called him. I can handle this, she said. She had more confidence in her ability to handle things than we did. Many evenings were spent arguing about whether the doctor on call should make an appearance. We'll just have to agree to disagree, Mrs. McWeenie said about 10 times per evening. She had an endless store of cliches. When Mrs. McWeenie said, we'll just have to agree to disagree, or little pitchers have big ears, or smile and the world smiles with you, cry and you cry alone, a faint but delighted grin came onto her face. Clearly she was nuts. We were locked up for 8 hours a day with a crazy woman who hated us. Mrs. McWeeny was unpredictable. She'd gnarl her face up for no reason while giving out bedtime meds and slam back into the nursing station without a word. We'd have to wait for her to calm down before getting our nightly Mickey fins. Sometimes we waited as long as half an hour. Every morning we complained to Valerie about Mrs. McWeeny, though we never said anything about waiting for our meds. We knew Mrs. McWeeny was a crazy person who had to earn a living. We weren't trying to get her decertified, we just wanted her off our ward. Valerie was unsympathetic to our complaints. Mrs. McWeeny is a professional, she said. She's been in this business a lot longer than I have. So what, said Georgina. She's fucking nuts, Lisa yelled. You don't have to yell, Lisa. I'm right here, said Valerie. We were all protecting Mrs. McWeeny one way or another. Mrs. McWeeny wasn't the only person in need of protection. Now and then there was an influx of student nurses. They were migratory, passing through our hospital on their way to operating rooms and cardiac care units. They followed real nurses around in a flock, asking questions and getting underfoot. Oh, that Tiffany, she sticks to me like a barnacle, the nurses would complain. Then we got the chance to say, sucks, doesn't it? Being followed around all the time? The nurses would have to grant us this point. The student nurses were about 19 or 20, our age. They had clean, eager faces and clean, ironed uniforms. Their innocence and incompetence aroused our pity, unlike the incompetence of aides, which aroused our scorn. This was partly because student nurses stayed only a few weeks, whereas aides were incompetent for years at a stretch. Mainly, though, it was because when we looked at the student nurses, we saw alternate versions of ourselves. They were living out lives we might have been living, if we hadn't been occupied with being mental patients. They shared apartments and had boyfriends and talked about clothes. We wanted to protect them so that they could go on living those lives. They were our proxies. They loved talking to us. We asked them what movies they'd seen and how they'd done on their exams and when they were getting married. Most of them had sadly small engagement rings. They'd tell us anything, that the boyfriend was insisting they, quote, do it before the wedding, that the mother was a drinker, that the grades were bad and the scholarship wasn't going to be renewed. We gave them good advice. Use a condom, call Alcoholics Anonymous, work hard for the rest of the semester and bring your grades back up. Later they'd report back to us, you were right, thanks a lot. We did our best to control our snarls and mutterings and tears when they were around. Consequently, they learned nothing about psychiatric nursing. When they finished their rotation, all they took with them were improved versions of us, halfway between our miserable selves and the normality we saw embodied in them. For some of us, this was the closest we would ever come to a cure. As soon as they left, things went quickly back to worse than usual, and the real nurses had their hands full. Thus, our keepers. As for finders, well, we had to be our own finders. All right, guys. Thank you so much for listening, and I promise it won't be so long between chapters in the future. Have a great rest of your day, and I'll be back soon with more stuff. Bye, guys.